Um, the first philosopher we're looking at today is Mary Wollstonecraft. Not sure if you've heard of her before. She's considered a proto-feminist because feminism hadn't been invented yet, basically. Most famous piece she wrote, kind of a toss-up, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. But the first famous piece she wrote was The Vindication of the Rights of Men. And she wrote that in response to Edmund Burke's piece on the revolution in France. And the reason that was kind of significant and why she became popular, well, I shouldn't say she became popular, the piece was popular. It was because Edmund Burke was a liberal in politics in England. He's kind of famous for a lot of his points of view, but he was a liberal, a Whig. Right? So if you're familiar with the Whig Party, well, the Whigs were the ones that really wanted to break away from the crown. They were unsuccessful in their revolution, so a lot of the Whigs that survived fled to the colonies, and that led to them becoming the main educators. For example, for Thomas Jefferson, William and Mary, the college was presided over by a Whig scholar. In any case, they embedded their revolutionary point of view, and notice it worked because the young men that were educated by them did in fact then, of course, start a revolution of sorts. You might not call it a revolution, just a breaking away from the homeland or the king. In a sense, it wasn't really a revolution because all the status quo stayed pretty much the same. So in a sense, it wasn't a revolution. But so the Whigs, but Edmund Burke was a Whig, and oddly enough, considering that the French Revolution was supposed to be liberal, a liberal revolt against the autocracy of the French king, right? Remember they chopped off his head. Marie Antoinette as well, right? Lots of other folks, etc. But it was Edmund Burke that argued against that revolution, arguing that it was going to result in chaos, that the problem was their political theory that the revolution was based on was not going to work. Remember, that was based on the social contract theory of Rousseau. And all his predictions about how horrendous things were going to get actually happened. And one of the things he also predicted was that eventually it would mean that the military would take over and some general would end up being the tyrant, instead of the king. And Edmund Burke apparently thought, I'm sorry about that, that it would be General Lafayette, which is kind of interesting because of the tie-in, of course, to our revolution and his work there, and why many towns in the United States have parks and things named Lafayette, right? In any case, we know it wasn't Lafayette, it was Napoleon that ended up doing that. So Burke was notorious as a liberal because he seemed to be a turncoat, to be arguing the opposite of what everyone expected him to support, the liberal revolution in France. Instead, he was very critical of it. And so an article appeared, Vindication of the Rights of Man, that argued against Burke's point of view and took a very liberal, supportive view of the revolution in France. And so everyone that was mad at Burke for his point of view in his article were very happy with that article. And the first time it was published, however, it was published anonymously, and everybody thought it was great. But the second time it was published, Mary Wollstonecraft's name was on it, and all of a sudden, everyone that did like it before hated it because, after all, it was just written by a woman. Why on earth, would you like an article written by a woman? So that's kind of mean and rotten. Nature taking its course. But the section that we have in the text is from her book on the vindication of the rights of women. And her main concern there was that women should be educated. And the problem was that women were educated, but only to do what? To be the housewives, to clean the house, cook, things of that sort, do the laundry, run the maid service, whatever the household required. And they were expected to just be the mothers, have the children, raise the children, take care of the house, and stay out of the way. And that, she thought, was totally inappropriate. That meant that women couldn't really fulfill their role. After all, they were half the population, and if you don't educate the women, it's not going to be good for the country. Some of those arguments John Stuart Mill and his wife, Harriet Taylor, used later on. But Mary is also famous because of her daughter, although having her daughter kind of killed her. She died either in childbirth or right after. And that daughter was also named Mary. And Mary, obviously not educated by her mother, but educated by her father. And her father was really kind of interesting. Mary's second husband, or first legitimate husband, William Godwin, who was also associated with utilitarianism. In any case, he educated his daughters. He was for educating women. And Mary grew up to marry Percy Bysshe Shelley. So we think of her daughter's name as Mary Shelley. That's the name she's famous under. And if you remember, she's the author of the book Frankenstein. So that's kind of interesting, the relationship there. But so this leads us, of course, into the discussion about feminism, woman's liberation. As I mentioned, Mary Wollstonecraft was a proto-feminist because feminism hadn't been invented yet. When we think of feminism, they usually refer to it as having three different waves of feminism. The first wave was successful. It took a while, but the women, especially we think of the women in the United States, those associated with Ford, of the Ford Motor Company, who was for them, but also against alcohol. So the interesting tie-in there was the women were for feminists, for women's rights, primarily things like voting rights, property ownership, inheritance, that they could inherit, and not just the men inherit things. But it was also tied in with banning alcohol, because that was what Ford was really after. He wanted to keep the men working in his automobile plants from drinking, so that they would show up and be good workers, etc. We know that the feminists won. They got the vote eventually. Alcohol was banned for a while, but we all know that all that did was make a few gangsters rich, including the Kennedy family, which is kind of interesting. They imported illegal scotch and sold that and made a fortune. In any case, so the first wave of feminism won what they were after and got the vote for women and property rights, etc. And that was pretty much what they were after. But it was the second wave that was kind of fascinating. That was the wave that I sort of participated in myself when I was in college, not so much because I believed in it wholeheartedly, but because if you wanted to date, you had to be supportive of the girls in college that were for that sort of. So I attended a few rallies and things of that sort. But of course, mostly because that way I was with. Actually, Donna became my wife eventually, so that worked. It worked for me, actually. But the second wave was the wave, or where the women wanted to change everything, employment, what women were allowed to do in the workplace, what kinds of jobs they could have. And so this was the wave where they wanted to break that glass ceiling and change the way women were treated in society and so on. And the basis for a lot of their argument was social contract theory, the idea that reality is socially constructed. And so basically a contract or a conceptual schema that we all agree on, and so if what we're essentially accepting as the reality, and for example, that individuals have specific roles based on their sex, right? And if that's the case, then it ought to be more just. We ought to change our point of view, and by changing our social agreement on what roles are appropriate to different sexes, we would essentially change the reality, change the socially constructed reality, so that everyone was treated fairly. That was the point of view, right? And granted, when you look at the socially constructed reality, and one of the main books it's still available, it's still for sale. You may very well find it in most bookstores. Beware, though, that the author wrote it to men. So the pronouns and things are incorrect in the book if you're looking at it from a modern perspective. But Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman were the authors. The Social Construction of Reality. It's a little book, about 200 pages, but was really quite significant, as it will say here. And it's really a very Hegelian point of view, takes the idea that so this was the European point of view. Peter Berger was actually from Germany originally, although his family moved to New York when he was young. He went to schools, high school in New York. He went to the New School, which was the new college there, etc. But he is also Lutheran, if that ties in. And part of that is because he's also, as a sociologist and a sociologist of knowledge, he's also a sociologist of religion. Although he died in 2017. But I think he wrote over 200 books. I think one of the other books I've mentioned a couple times in class so far was The Heretical Imperative, the book that argues that just being raised in the United States, you're forced to be a heretic because the government declares that your religious belief is your choice, and that's the basis for heresy. But so there's Peter Berger. But so the socially constructed reality makes it sound like reality is totally up for us to decide, but that's a misunderstanding of the book, a misunderstanding of the thesis. It is Hegelian in the sense that we dialectically create concepts, and those concepts can in turn create objects. Peter Berger refers to this as objectification. It was one of the reasons I liked it in college, is it gave me some really long words. So it enables us to create objects, objectify things. For example, money, a terrific example. All right, money is totally human, psychologically invented. Doesn't really, if you think of the weight and the value of a piece of paper, obviously it doesn't have any intrinsic value. It's an extrinsic value in the sense that as long as everyone believes it's valuable, you can trade it for something of a certain value. And by the way, you can see how this plays out in Venezuela right now, when their own currency, where the government's just printing off money with no basis for the value of the money. Nobody finds that money valuable, whereas if they get a hold of dollars, which are based on the United States currency, of course, then they feel that those are valuable. So dollars, it's a dollar economy actually, because of the total ridiculousness of what's happened to their own currency, right? And it's all psychology, but psychology based on what actually happens in fact, right? With the way other people refuse to accept it. When you come up with a wheelbarrow full of money and no one wants to accept it for anything, but if you have a couple of bucks, they'll take that, right? So it is socially constructed, but nature is always playing on the edges of how that socially constructed reality actually works, right? So you can't just invent things that are, oh gosh, we ought to just have 2 chickens in every pot, right? Poof, everybody believe you have 2 chickens in every pot. Doesn't really work. You actually have to figure out a way to raise more chickens, right? So obviously the socially constructed reality has lots of intriguing possibilities, and that's been very useful in lots of ways. On the other hand, that doesn't give you carte blanche to change the way you want to picture reality and expect reality to fit that bill. So the problem, of course, then is with feminists that believed that women's roles ought to be just. They ought to be the same. So what they meant by equality was sameness. So if I want to be an engineer, I should be able to be an engineer, etc. What a lot of that did, and why that movement was so frustrated and eventually changed into what was called the third wave of feminism, which I think has basically been criticized as a wave where the feminists that led that wave were basically men haters and so frustrated with their lack of ability to change things that they just became, in a sense, ridiculous. A perfect example of one of those feminists is brain fart. Are we allowed? Can I use the word fart in that context? I'll think of it. Let me instead play this, because this is Helena Cronin, and she, I would say, represents kind of the correct or contemporary point of view on feminism. Is that going to get me in trouble?
On the way to a better world, in pursuit of an admirable quest, that is, a world free of sex discrimination, where you're judged on your own qualities and not your sex. Truth and falsity went topsy-turvy. The truth, the science of sex differences, became dangerous, unmentionable. And in its place, face the conventional wisdom, which is a ragbag of ideas that have long been extinct but are kept ghoulishly alive by popularity, they became the entrenched orthodoxy, influencing public thinking, agendas, and policy making, and completely crowding out science and sense. Now, my aim is to show you why the current orthodoxy should be abandoned, and why, if you really care about a fairer world, the science does matter, and it matters profoundly. I'm going to take two examples, both about the professions, because they really very well epitomize the orthodox litany, how society systematically discriminates against women, and how at work they are victims of pervasive sexism.
Is this too fast? I could slow it
So,
down.
here are the conventional wisdoms. Well, women in ghettos. Why in medicine are men from surgery, women from pediatrics? In law, men from corporate, women from family. In science, men from physics, women from sociology. It's because women are ghettoized into stereotypically female professions and specialties, where prestige and pay are the lowest. And why is it always men at the top? The highest positions and prizes, whether influence or income, heads of state, CEOs, professors, Nobel laureates. Why? Because for women, there's a glass ceiling, for men, there's a glass elevator. Well, but you might be thinking, isn't that conventional wisdom true? Isn't the evidence compelling? No. Nonsense. It's wholly misconceived. It's both ignorant of modern science and it's fighting battles that have already been won. But before I explain to you about that, I've got two caveats. One is about averages. We'll be comparing averages, not differences between individuals. Try not to think in individuals, but about differences between groups. Specifically, how characteristics are distributed differently in the two groups, males and females. And second, let me stress that I'm emphatically not denying that discrimination exists. I'm not denying that. Rather, it can't be the whole story, and it certainly isn't the story in the way that it's generally told. So let's get straight to some science of sex differences, and I'll start with tastes, that is, with interests. There's an experiment in which sex-stereotyped toys, trucks and dolls, were given to mixed-sex groups. Now, I'm sure that all of you will guess correctly which sex preferred which, but these males and females were vervet monkeys. Now consider newborn babies. Even at 1 day old, girls prefer a human face and boys prefer mechanical mobile. Now, neither those monkeys nor babies had been brainwashed, socialized, stereotyped, ghettoized, or any of these other things, and they hadn't even encountered toys or mobiles previously. Rather, what these results of these little experiments capture is an evolved sex difference in interests. Women are far more interested in people, and men are far more interested in things. This difference is one of the largest of all psychological differences between the sexes, and also it's by far the largest when measured in career interests. And that difference in career interests, by the way, hasn't changed over the past century since records were first kept. Even though there have been massive social changes, that still stands out as the largest difference in career interests. What's more, it's been found that a person's interests are the most powerful predictor of what their entire career will be like, even more so surprisingly than talent. So, look at females in the UK professions. From over 80% in the people-oriented, down to 6% in things-oriented. Well, ghettoisation? Really? Or might it not be choice? By the way, even those 6% female engineers are overwhelmingly in bioengineering, that is, working with people or other living things. And even women in the top 1% of mathematical ability, 1%, that's very, very high, choose instead, unlike their male counterparts, they often choose careers working with people, again, people and living things, biosciences, doctors, and so on. And yet, the conventional wisdom stubbornly refuses to acknowledge that women's own interests might be a cause of how they choose their what careers they're in. And now to temperaments and men at the top. Men are vastly more competitive than women. I'll tell you why very quickly. Quick evolutionary sketch. Give a man 50 wives and he'd have children galore, but a woman with 50 husbands, no advantage whatsoever. So, natural selection favoured men who competed strenuously for mates. And all men now are descendants of those victorious competitors. From this, much follows. Men are far more ambitious, status-seeking, hierarchical, single-minded, opportunistic, persevering, risk-taking. Their entire life strategy is a far higher risk, higher stakes game, and far more dedicated to winning. They notoriously find any area to be first, most, biggest, best. I got from the Guinness Book of Records, beer mat flipping, haggis hurling, or extreme ironing. There are worse ones than that, I can tell you. And they even appropriate all the summits. This was recently held in Paris, the Global Summit of Women. Meanwhile, what are women like? Well, they're sort of far less of all the above. That's the best way to think of it. Now, obviously, greater male competitiveness alone pushes men to the top powerfully, but science also reveals another such sex difference. It's to do with the tails of these statistical distributions, that is, the ends of the curves. No. For all sex differences in all species, this is not just humans, all sex differences in all species, there's a difference in the shape of the tails. Among males, the variance, that's the difference between the best and the worst, and the most and the least, or whatever it is, tallest and shortest, is far greater than among females. Females tend to cluster round the mean, that curve there, in the middle. Females tend to cluster around the mean. The tails are far less far apart, but among males, the variance can be great, huge. So males are almost bound to be overrepresented, both at the bottom and at the top. I think of this, I usually say metaphorically, as more dumbbells, but more Nobels. An extreme example of the right-hand tail, which even the scientist who found it said in the paper staggering, for the ability in mechanical reasoning in the top 0.1%, that's admittedly a very rarefied atmosphere. Try and guess what the male-female ratio is. It's 236 to 1. That's how far the Nobel's dumbbells effect can push the difference between males and females. Now, greater male variance, as you can see in that extreme example, can profoundly influence male-female differences, particularly those that most enrage conventional wisdom, that is, the predominance of men at the top, always looking to the top, never at the dumbbells. But nevertheless, greater male variance has become what in the States is called a third rail issue, that is, touch it and you die. And that precludes any investigation of what is really a very potent cause. So, sex differences stem ultimately from different reproductive strategies, but they pervade our entire psychology, and their distribution differs, giving rise to differences between the two groups. So the life priorities of men and women are not identical. I'll repeat, not identical, because the orthodoxy conflates equality and sameness. Constantly, when people are concerned about equality, what they immediately jump into instead is sameness. But you can't expect sameness for males and females. On average, there are these differences. So conventional wisdom began with an injustice, with women being denied choice just because they were women. But that's morphed into a deeply misguided quest. Sameness of outcome for males and females in all fields, 50-50, 50%. Well, that's not good enough. Conventional wisdom is a science-free zone with factoids where facts should be, and a dreadful jargon generator where theories should reign. It's outrageous that it should be taken seriously at all, that it occupies a position where science and evidence should prevail, and that it dominates policy, even though its precepts have long been rendered utterly extinct, first by a scientific understanding of sex differences, and second, through political progress against sex discrimination. Now, science doesn't dictate goals. I'm not saying it's only science, but it can help us to achieve our goals. And as Marx didn't ever quite say, if we want to change the world, we first need to understand it. And how can we forge a fairer world if we allow beliefs that are long extinct to stand in the way of what is really indispensable, the Darwinian science of sex differences? Thank you.
So the feminist I was thinking of earlier is Andrea Dworkin, and that's her here.
Good evening. Welcome to another edition of After Dark. Tonight's subject, sex. What is it for? And with me to discuss that, I have with me on my left, Julia Ronder, Edinburgh-born, 26-year-old psychiatrist in training at Brighton, having qualified as a doctor at the Middlesex Hospital. She's had a number of personal relationships, one almost ending in marriage, but in recent years has taken what she has described as an absolute decision that will last for the rest of my life, that is to say, to remain celibate.
That I read over a 5-year period while I was writing this book. And I had written a book several years ago on pornography. It's called Pornography and Men Possessing Women. And when I was writing that, I read all of the scientific literature, the social studies, the psychology, all that kind of stuff. And I basically felt that it was worthless in terms of human experience. I mean,
here's more about Andrea. She's dead. She died 2005. She was very angry. However, biographically, reading about what happened to her, you can absolutely understand why she would have been so angry. In fact, I remember reading that she went to Paris to attend a conference on feminism, and the evening that she arrived at the hotel and checked into her room, a bottle of champagne or something was delivered to her room, which she drank some of, and it had a knockout chemical in, and during the evening she was raped. Never found out by who or anything. Can you imagine somebody doing that to her just because of her notoriety, etc., in attendance at that. But so when I posted the video here, This is a video that's another panel.
Today's students need balance in work, life, and school to give you the type of learning experience.
And notice,
here, and I can't see any, lady in the middle of the
notice
black.
Helena Cronin is in this panel.
Say your name quickly if you would as well.
You'll notice if you watch this video that virtually every single individual in the panel is absolutely appalled at her point of view.
One of the things that I wanted to note was Helena.
So that's kind of interesting if you have the chance, if you haven't already, to watch that. And Helena Cronin's one book, I'm not sure if she's got more than the one, but Cronin, and it's The Ant and the Peacock. And so this is a dense scientific analysis of some sexual differences among different kinds of animals, including, of course, the ant and the peacock. And the concern she has in this book is the ant. Notice, well, let me frame this by saying that the book she is targeting with this book was the book by Richard Dawkins titled The Selfish Gene. Anybody familiar with that? The Selfish Gene? Yes?
I'll read it now for a
Oh, okay. So, by the way, Dawkins points out he doesn't think of genes as having personalities and being selfish. His main point basically is that the gene's strategy appears to be reproduction. And so that what genes tend to do is primarily in order to make sure that they reproduce. And so it becomes a question when you look at genes like ants, where the workers, ants, are not reproducing, right? So the question is, what's the goal of their genes if they're actually not developing in order to reproduce themselves, right? And of course leads to the sense that they're aware of the proximity of the genes of what the queen is producing to themselves, and so protecting those genes is part of their strategy, right? But they're not selfish genes themselves because they're sacrificing themselves for the good of the anthill or whatever, the colony, right? It's kind of interesting. I remember reading once that I ended up not having biological children myself. I adopted children, and of course everyone else in my siblings have had biological children, and I read that genetically I should be more concerned about the survival of my brother's children than my own. Because mine are adopted, they're not genetically mine. And so in a sense, I should have a genetic attachment to the survival of my brother's children, etc. So that kind of puzzled me. And of course it brings up the whole question about, well, how deeply do you love your children when you're an adopted family, right? That's kind of intriguing. Of course it ties into foster children as well, right? And what about the way you feel about, say, students, etc. When you think, I love one of the students, the graduate students of Richard Dawkins was Susan Blackmore, and she was thrilled with his book. I think it's page 198, where he talks about memes. He invents that basically on that page and comes up with the idea of a meme. It's kind of like a gene, right? The only thing is that the meme is a meaningful living organism, so to speak, right? So dun 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 dun, right? You might think, wait a minute, that's not alive. Yet, in a sense, if we define what life is the way Stuart Kaufman does, by saying that it's any complex system that uses energy to produce work and reproduces itself, it actually satisfies those criterion because it's a complex system, right, which can be repeated. It obviously uses energy in order to be expressed, and it's catchy, right? So everyone hears it and repeats it, right? So in a sense, it's life, right? So memes, in that sense, are like genes, that they're also life forms. And of course, that becomes a very complex issue. A criticism of Susan Blackmore's book, The Meme Machine. The meme machine. We are the meme machine because we catch these viruses, or we hear them, or whatever, right? And then we pass them on, right? So we become infected with these memes, right? And when you hear something that you like, it's catchy, and you can't get it out of your head, and you infect others with it, right? So in a sense, memes are live organisms that take us. And the interesting thing is there's whole segments of society that become more interested in spreading the memes that infect their head than in passing their own genes. So for example, well, obviously not all priests, sorry about that, but at least most priests, theoretically, are celibate and not interested in passing on their genes, but they're interested in passing on the memes, you know. Gloria in excelsis Deo, etc. Right? Sorry, I have no talent, I know. But you get the idea, you know. So memes are passed on, and you can literally be more interested in passing on your memes, you know, Vive la France, you know, or whatever, right? You know, rather than actually spreading your own genetic material. So, but it's an infection in that sense, right? So that's kind of intriguing. But when we get back to Helena Cronin, wherever I lost her. So the ant somehow is trying to make sure that the whole hive or colony is what survives rather than its own particular genetic material, which is obviously different, right, to some extent. And then the other would be something like the peacock, the peacock, which, of course, famously the male, the peacock, right, you know, the peahen is the female, right, the peacock has an absolutely glorious tail, which scientists apparently all think is absolutely useless as far as survival is concerned, because it uses up an awful lot of energy, I suppose, sort of like long blonde hair, you know, whatever, right? But if you think, what does that tail do for the plumage do for the peacock? It attracts the peahen, right? So her study in this book points out that the peahens select the peacocks that they will mate with based on their tail. Now, that was anti-Darwinian, by the way, because Darwin's basic, or at least an interpretation of his basic thesis, is that the survival of the fittest, right? So it's the fittest males that determine whether or not they survive or not. But in this particular analysis, it's the females that select the males that will get to pass on their genes. And so that gives a lot more power to the females in that relationship. And so that was criticized by a lot of evolutionary biologists. So that's kind of intriguing. So that's an interesting book, although it is, I confess, I never made it through the whole dang thing. It was kind of dense, but interesting. So Helena Cronin, kind of an interesting individual, not politically correct, I suspect. I remember years ago, I think I felt pretty conservative in a lot of ways, but I kept my mouth shut because I wanted to keep my job. And, you know, university professors tend to be more liberal, although it's not a necessity, right? So you've probably heard that. It's been, by the way, pretty annoying because an awful lot of my colleagues are not familiar with philosophy enough to understand, I think, what's going on. But remember, I'm trying to avoid being an asshole and telling them how they should actually understand things. So, and plus, remember, I retired from the Army and I'm just here I was here as a term, now I'm confusedly retired, so I'm just an adjunct now, whatever. Who knows what I am. In any case, when I would be on panels and things of that sort, I would always keep my mouth shut. Because if you know, I remember at one conference, the table was all women, and one of the things they were all thrilled about was the student population of UAA had gotten to the point where it was no longer 50-50 or 60-40 men, 60 women, 40, but instead it had flipped and had become women 64% to men 36% or something of that sort. I'm not sure what it is right now, but I think it was still moving in that same direction. And it's not just UAA, but that's, I think, a nationwide trend that women tend to be the ones that go on for higher education and are the ones that are currently getting more of the educated jobs, etc., in our society. And I remember at that time that the panel of women were all like, yay! Like, we're winning. And I was thinking, wait a minute, weren't we supposed to be looking for parity? Wasn't it important? Wasn't the goal so that we get to equality, not women winning? That doesn't really help us, does it? What we want is both sexes to be in balance, etc. So that sort of thing kind of bugged me, but of course I didn't complain because of course I could have been easily just not rehired. And usually those panels were the women in the faculty who were really in more superior roles. And I think that's still a dominant point of view that you know, in a sense, when we go back to Andrea Dworkin and the third wave of feminists, they've reached the conclusion that men are the reason for all of the troubles in the world. And if what we want to do is fix the problems with poverty, capitalism, competitiveness, war, what we've got to do is get men out of control of things. And then we won't have wars, and women will be so much nicer and everything. I don't know if you want to start yelling and screaming at this point, but the intriguing thing when Hillary Clinton, of course, was running as president, and we were all thrilled. Wow, we've got a woman running for president, and yet at the same time, no one liked her. Well, I mean, a lot of people didn't like her, right? And I was like, well, you know, gee, you know, but what's your alternative? Trump? Wow. You know, what's life going to be like in the United States if he wins? Now we know, right? Well, so I confess, I voted for Hillary. My wife did not. She voted for someone else She doesn't even remember that person's name, but when she saw there was another name there, she voted for that. And I thought, what a waste. You know, that person can't possibly win. However, the odd thing is, why did people not like Hillary? And I think the reason for it is that the role that you play helps define the kind of person you are. Hillary became a kind of woman that people didn't like as a woman because she was bossy, she was in charge of things, she was telling people what to do and so on, and not smiling all the time. In fact, I think in one of the debates, Trump literally looked at her and said, what a mean woman she was, something of that sort, right? You know, because she wouldn't be the nice woman, you know, that, you know, women are kind of expected to be friendly and nice and courteous and agreeable. And the thing is, if you're going to be Secretary of State or you're going to run for president, you can't be agreeable all the time. You have to be careful, or you become deplorable yourself. You know, for calling certain people deplorables. You know, kind of Hillary put herself in her own deplorable basket when she did that, right? But you get the idea. If the role is going to transform the person in order to become the kind of person that, I mean, to be president, do you have to be a bully? Would you say? I mean, I don't know. I should open the floor up for you guys to comment, if you like. How's any of this affect you? We're a very conservative state, so my guess is that most people here feel pretty acceptable or accepting of the argument that we should, of course, do away with discrimination, but at the same time that women are different than men. Does that make sense? Kind of an agreement? There are some, of course, interesting biological details. Notice she pointed out that she was talking about averages and not individuals. And when we look at sex differences, one of the things, right, everybody knows we've got XX genes are going to be female. By the way, I know one student, well, she wasn't actually a student of mine, she was a student of the university that I knew, who has since graduated and gone on to other things, but she only had one X gene. She didn't have two X's. That's, what's it called? I can never remember the name of that. Turner syndrome? Something like that. They usually didn't live, by the way. But in any case, she did. But so the normal woman has an XX. There are some that have, I think, extra as well as less. Then there are males, and the male is XY, right? Everybody knows that. The Y, by the way, is the smallest we have. So Adam's curse. I don't know if I'm going to find. I don't want the poem. Trying to think of the author's name. Ah, here it is, Brian Sykes. Another book he wrote is The Seven Daughters of Eve. And what he's talking about there is when we look at our DNA, we find that as we go back, there were originally 7 women that have the DNA that explains all the women that are alive today. By the way, that can be condensed to 1. And that woman is referred to not by the DNA, but by their mitochondria. And that woman is known as the mitochondrial Eve, right? You're all familiar with that at all? Yes, okay. By the way, there was an original Adam too. The odd thing is they believe that the original Adam and the mitochondrial Eve were separated by thousands of years. So that's pretty weird. You're putting Adam and Eve together. But so his book, Adam's Curse, A Future Without Men, points out that over time, the Y chromosome keeps being damaged, and it doesn't grow. So it's not like XX chromosomes blend together, and you end up then with daughters that have new variants of the X chromosome. But the males, if you looked at the Y chromosome of any of the males here, and you go back multiple generations, you'll discover that your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather has precisely the same Y chromosome that you do, except for any deterioration that has happened since that individual. In the book, this one, Adam's Curse, one of the things he starts the book out talking about is he was the geneticist that was invited to examine the body that was found in the Alps, the so-called Iceman, when they discovered that the Iceman wasn't a recent murder that the police were supposed to be involved with, but instead had been shot in the back with an arrow, and that all his equipment and everything were prehistoric, and so on. So they realized they had a body that was thousands of years old, and when they did a genetic analysis of he was a red-haired guy, turned out to be exactly the same Y chromosome that Brian Sykes' neighbor in London had. So the idea, of course, is that the Y chromosome, smallest chromosome we have, and it's shrinking because as it gets damaged, it can't repair itself and grow. And so theoretically and roughly, he says 500,000 years, not tomorrow, right? 500,000 years, there will be no males left. And so feminism will really win then, right? We'll have to come up with some other way of reproducing, I suppose. I'm pretty sure you'll have ways by then. So that's kind of interesting. But when you tie this, what's the deal here? When she talked about the various curves, because women have XX chromosomes, they tend to blend into a closer average than the males, which, as she says, the tails on either the left or the right of the curve tend to be the extreme ones, which is why we have males who are more dumb and males who are more brilliant. So that's, that, of course, you could still have individual women that are equally as dumb or equally as brilliant, although there are fewer of them because of that average, right? By the way, that also ties into things when you talk about the bell curve and intelligence, for example. The bell curve, I don't know where I'm typing here. Bell curve, and what I want is this one. I think some of you are actually doing Charles Murray as your philosopher too. Misty, right? Is Misty here? Misty Murray? No? You don't want to admit it. Sorry. Could be my other class too. In any case, so Charles Murray and Herrnstein, and the argument in this book, and this is a pet peeve of mine, by the way, if you actually read the book, it's not about race, but it has been interpreted as a racist book. Remember, just recently, Charles Murray was literally attacked at Middlebury College. is my initial there. So this was Charles Murray giving a lecture at Middlebury College a couple of marches ago. And you've heard about the arguments about free speech in colleges, on campus. And what they did was they basically stood up and yelled and screamed at him and would not let him speak.
John Stuart Mill claimed that when there are persons to be found who form an exception to the apparent unanimity of the world on any subject, even if the world is right, it is always probable that dissensions have something worth hearing to say for themselves, and that the truth would lose something by their silence. I'm here today with the hope that we can live up to our values.
That's not Charles Murray, that's the student who's introducing him.
I would like you all to remember the calls that were made by many on this campus, both past and present, for honest, inclusive, yet rigorous debate and discussion. Well, I invite you today to express your opinions. These are truths! And invite you to welcome with me this evening's speaker, Dr. Charles Murray.
This is going to be a real anticlimax. I had thought. I had thought before I started.
So they basically had a riot, didn't let him speak, and caught him and the professor from Middlebury who had invited him at the door as they were getting out to the car, and they grabbed her by her hair and yanked it and hurt her neck. So the next time you saw her, she was wearing a neck brace, etc. So that was one of the significant events that kind of led to this big confrontation over free speech at campuses. And why were they mad at him? They were mad at him because of this book, the reputation the book has that argues that intelligence is based on race. But if you read the book, you'll discover they even have a specific paragraph that say, if you interpret this argument as saying that intelligence is race-based, you are misunderstanding what we are arguing. The statistics can be bad, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's race-based. In fact, in the book and other places, he points out that, number one, there's a human race, not biologically, right, today. Plus, if we were going to take something like race into account, we would have to have over 2,000 races because there's really not just one race that is like the Caucasian race or the black race or the yellow race or the red race or any of those. Certainly those are social constructs. Remember the idea of the social construction of reality, and that's something I've seen argued about. If you're familiar with Dinesh D'Souza, for example, one of his his first book was Illiberal Education, but his second one was The End of Racism, which was absolutely interesting. Wow, you can get that for a low price. Wow. Wait a minute. What is that? I have no idea what I'm looking at. Oh, there it is. End racism. And basically his argument, following the socially constructed reality thesis, is that all we have to do to end racism is stop defining races. Especially governmental forms, stop asking people what their race is, and within a generation, race will go away, because we won't have the concept anymore. It's kind of interesting. Of course, that's not going to happen, and that's what a lot of people said, etc. But back to Murray's book, which I guess I lost. Maybe it was on this page. But the concern that Murray and Herrnstein have in their book, The Bell Curve, is that intelligence, and by the way, education associated with that, is becoming more and more important in our current economy, so that in order to get the kind of jobs that will enable you to live that expected middle-class life, you're going to have to not only be educated, but also intelligent. And there is a genetic relationship between who is intelligent and who is not, right? It's not racial, but nonetheless it does run in families, by the way. So that's kind of intriguing, right? And of course it does have environmental influences as well. So your family's genetic history might mean that you can have plenty of intelligence, but unless you live in an environment where you have enough nutrition, you have enough stimulation, right, all of those things that we know are important for increasing intelligence, raising brilliant children, getting them to read, the importance of reading. Even with all of the distractors we have today, reading is still absolutely essential, because that's the main way we get long drawn-out arguments into our minds, plus the history associated with a point of view that you really have to understand the past leading up to now to understand why the now is the way it is, right? And how do you get that history? By reading about the history. Is video certainly changing the way we learn? Certainly it is. Notice I use videos a lot myself, but at the same time, reading still is an essential part of that. By the way, over my life, I've discovered that I used to be able to read for a longer period of time, and more often during the day than I do now, because I'm very attracted to the media. You've noticed I've spent a lot of time on YouTube, I spend a lot of time on Facebook. I think they're very powerful tools, but at the same time they do distract you. Plus reading, while I'm reading a book, if I read about something, oh, the island of Capri, right away I was like, where exactly is that island? I go check. And in fact, I could use Google Earth to travel around Capri and see all the different things. This is where Tiberius had his palace, etc. Right? Oh, interesting. What was it? Oh, the book. Go back to the book, right? So yeah, you get distracted. It's interesting. It's powerful. The visual stimuli is absolutely amazing. But at the same time, we still need the books in order to learn the information. And have the stamina. I remember one student years ago, I did a presentation on a book by an anthropologist, and the book was about 800 pages, but he gave a presentation in about 45 minutes that explained the book. So I used that book to mention, this book, and he gives you the summary of it. And still, the 45 minutes I thought was a long presentation that required concentration. And I remember, though, after playing that, the one student said, "I'm going to read that book." And in fact, he went out and he got the book, and the next time he was in class, he looked at me and he had shock on his face. And he said, "How do you read a book?" Because he had gotten the book, started reading it, got up to about page 3, and was mentally exhausted by that exercise. And it suddenly, and it's 800 pages, right? Right? How on earth do you do this, right? Well, I mean, you can't just start with an 800-page book on society. The book, by the way, was titled Collapse. I don't know if I can find the book just that easy, since the word collapse is pretty... I don't know if this is even it, or is this a... There it is. Very depressing book, by the way. He tried to make sure that it wasn't completely depressing, so he put a couple of success stories in it. By the way, he was a speaker here quite a few years ago when this book was, you know how they do a book tour, and so he was here and gave a lecture at the Wendy Williamson, and by the way, it was packed, absolutely packed. I remember seeing women with their children sitting in their laps. Can you imagine the Wendy Williamson being that packed? I should ask a quiz question before everyone has to leave. What's a good one? Have I been politically incorrect in my presentation of feminism? Do you think I've been politically incorrect? And I guess I gotta quit, huh? That's questions. Do you have any questions? You want to throw anything at me? I was raised Roman Catholic, so I like punishment. But not sexual abuse. By the way, all the priests I knew, none of them ever did anything I thought was reprehensible. Although they occasionally did smack me for things I didn't think I deserved. Actually, the nuns were worse. My very first nun, Sister Mary Immaculate, scared the crap out of me. I know where George Lucas got the idea for Darth Vader. It was Sister Mary Immaculate. Oh, by the way, there's a lecture tonight in the library at 7 o'clock by a visiting professor of philosophy who's going to talk about God, Paul, and Pinker, Stephen Pinker. If you're in the consortium on campus, 7 o'clock tonight, there will be food, by the way. Some of the stuff you can use. Hello. Oh, you can pick her. Yes, okay. Yes, you can. I like her. I think she's fantastic. So do you think I was politically incorrect?
Right out your response right now. I don't believe it's politically incorrect. That's my first thing. What does politically incorrect or correct mean?
Well, you're in the right class. Yay.
I'm doing well.